So welcome to this talk on demystifying flights. I know finding a cheap flight is always a pain in the butt. Nobody ever wants to spend, a ton of money, and we don't want to be the person spending the most because we know prices change all the time. So in this talk, we're going to kind of demystify flights, talk with Scott, who runs Going, or founded Going, which was formerly Scott's Cheap Flights, named after him. He's written a book on flights and taking more vacations. And we're going to talk about myths, best time to book, tips, tricks, and answer all your questions. This talk will be moderated by Katie, who is maybe in the top left of your screen. Who knows where Zoom is putting everybody, who also works with Scott over at Going. And so at the end of this, we are going to take your questions, and I am going to, there's a little like raise your hand button, and then I'm going to call on you, unmute you, so no background noise, and we'll just kind of hear your question and answer it. So with that, I'm going to send it over to Katie to take it from here.
Awesome. Thanks, Matt. Hi, everyone. I'm Katie. I also work for Going, an avid traveler, and here to help moderate this great conversation. I'm sure we all have the ever-present question of when should I book my flight? How do I find great deals? All of the above circling our brains all the time, especially with summer travel upon us. So let's get into it. All right. So, guys, gentlemen, when is the best time to book a flight? Maybe you've got a trip in mind, or you just know a time period that you want to go somewhere. When is a great time to book a flight? Scott, I'll start with you.
All right. So I think the best time to book your flight, and this is going to sound reductive, but allow me a moment to explain. The best time to book your flight is when the flight is cheap. But the question is, when are the fares going to be cheap? Because look, if you've got a month of 30 days, 29 of those 30 days, prices tend to be expensive. It's pretty rare that you see the price drop, but when it does, that is when you want to book. So when is it most likely to drop is the real question. And we like to point to something called a Goldilocks window. Rather than thinking, oh, exactly 63 days in advance, like some folks will say, or, oh, you need to book on Tuesday at 1 p.m., like others will say. I think all that is basically a myth at this point. Instead, the best time to book is when cheap flights are going to be most likely to pop up, which that Goldilocks window idea for domestic flights, about 1 to 3 months in advance of travel. For international flights, more like 2 to 8 months when you're traveling off peak. But if you're hoping to go during a peak period, think Christmas, New Year, middle of summer, even going to Ireland for St. Patrick's Day, you want to add a few months to those recommendations. The final thing I'll say about the Goldilocks window is that not every flight is cheap during a Goldilocks window. Right now we're about 1 to 3 months out. So let's say you're hoping to travel in late May, take a Memorial Day flight, go visit family. Not every flight is going to be cheap right then, even though we're in the Goldilocks window, but your odds of a cheap flight are best. So if they're not cheap today, your best bet is patience. Wait till tomorrow when you've got another chance for a cheap flight to pop up. Matt, anything I missed there?
No, so piggybacking on what you said, my question then to you is, what do you think about all these like websites that track prices, right? Google Flights has these price tracking, and everyone's always talking about like, oh, look at all this stuff so you can find the best time to book.
I think that the price trackers and the price recommendations that a lot of sites give can be a helpful broad sense that, like, okay, look, right now, if you're looking to book a flight for next Valentine's Day 2025, the price trackers will probably tell you it's too early to book, that prices are too high, and they would be correct. So I think in broad strokes, they can guide you in the right direction. I think the problem, though, is sometimes they get a little bit too precise. Sometimes they'll say, look, 63 days in advance is when you see the cheapest flights. And that may be true on average, but you don't have an average flight. And for the intents and purposes of trying to get a cheap flight, average doesn't really matter. And let me give you an example or corollary. Let's say you're playing the stock market. You're hoping to find a good stock that you think is going to take off, and you're looking at what day is the best for when the stock market overperforms. You could look at all the dates of 2023 and say, well, look, April 15th was the day you saw stock market perform the best. So I'm going to circle April 15th on my calendar this year for when I should buy my stocks. I think most folks recognize just because it was the best day last year doesn't tell you anything about what is going to be the best day this year. Past performance is no guarantee of future results. And that's why I think it's better to think in these broad windows rather than to be thinking very narrowly about specific days.
I also tell people, if you could predict airline prices, you'd be the richest person in the world, right? I mean, so
It's the
the
most
other thing,
volatile thing we purchase.
yeah, and I would say the other thing is that if that worked, airlines would obviously change their pricing model, right? Like if you could predict future airline prices, then what would airlines need to do, right? Because you would just wait. Everyone would only book on the day that it's the cheapest.
Uh, That's exactly right. I'd never really put two and two together there, but that's an important point as well.
Awesome. So, Scott, I think just along that line of, what are some other myths that go into the whole booking process? I'm pretty sure that all of us have heard the book at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday. Is there a specific day? Obviously not, but is there a specific time of the day that you should look to book when it's going to be cheapest versus another?
Not in terms of when you can expect to book the cheapest flights. And that's look, you can look at that as bad news or good news. The bad news, there's no cheapest time to book. The good news, cheap flights are popping up all the time. You don't need to circle one specific day of the week or time of day when you need to be searching. Instead, they could be popping up anytime you search, or you can use a service like Goings that makes sure you don't miss out when those great deals do pop up again at random. But one thing I do want to make sure we differentiate between is while there aren't cheapest days or times to book your flight, there are cheapest days and times to actually take your flight. And so that's typically going to be Tuesdays and Wednesdays are the cheapest days to actually fly. Historically, Saturday was in there as well. That's been a little bit less so since the pandemic began, but Tuesdays and Wednesdays are when you typically see the cheapest flights. Usually you're going to see the cheapest ones as well for those early morning flights. So if you're an early riser, can set that alarm, you're going to benefit from a cheaper fare, and you're also going to benefit from a flight that's much more likely to arrive on time. Those early morning flights have an on-time arrival rate that's about 25 percentage points higher than flights in the afternoon or evening. So good on you if you can take advantage.
I will say, this like again going back to these myths, right? Everybody like if all these things that you see pop up that are just lazy journalism, about finding a cheap flight on a Tuesday, staying on a Saturday, clearing your cookies. That's a big one that persists everywhere. If all these things worked, the airlines would have changed them by now, right? Like think, you know, going back to the same thing, if everybody knows it's cheaper to buy your flight on Tuesday, who's going to book a flight on any other day of the week? If the incognito browsing is a huge myth, they would just be switched by now. So whenever you see a lot of these like secret travel hacks on BuzzFeed or whatever, it's some 27-year-old new hire who searched some stuff on the internet, put it all together, and made it real from it,
Yeah,
and
the thing about getting cheap flights that I like to remind people is that if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. There are absolutely ways to get cheap flights, but it's not a matter of hack. works. It's not a matter of just, this one simple trick that's going to get you cheap flights. It's much more a matter of changing your strategy, changing the way that you search for flights, making sure you're booking during the Goldilocks windows, making sure that you're, trying to not unintentionally give up the flexibility that you have, all these sorts of strategies that help you get cheap flights. But it's not a matter of clearing your cookies or going to this one search engine or things like that. Those are fortunately, unfortunately, myths.
Yeah. And I'll also add to that, there are general rules, as Scott is saying, but one thing I like to do is after I book a flight, I set a price alert to see if the price drops. Because post COVID, and I just did this with a hotel because I'm going to Miami. This works for hotels too. Um, Post COVID, there's no cancellation fees. So if there's a fare difference, you can cancel the old flight and buy the new flight. Now you'll get the fare difference as an e-credit. So like it's not cash back. So you have to fly that airline again. But it's a way to save money that I think, again, is strategic in terms of like all these rules we're going to talk about today with Scott is about shifting how you book flights, not looking for that one secret tip that will change your life.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought up that changing of prices and how to take advantage, because you mentioned not only airfare and hotels, it also worked for car rentals. Look, last week, my family, we were on spring break. We went down to Santa Barbara and San Luis Obispo, and I booked the car rental about 3 months ago, and when it was originally $479 for 5 days. But every Monday, I had a little reminder on my calendar, check the price of the car rental. 6 times between when I actually first booked and when we actually took the trip, the price had dropped. So I canceled my old reservation, booked the new one. By the time the trip rolled around, the price was down to $248. I got it nearly half of what I'd originally booked it at just by checking after I'd booked and seeing if there were any price drops.
Yeah, I saved $200 in my hotel. Yeah.
Amazing. Amazing.
So, uh, okay. I know Katie has other questions. So,
No, all good, man. Yeah, I guess still along the same lines of myth busting here. What about dressing up nicely for an upgrade? I feel like this is also something we see on those listicles out there that, commonly gets brought up. So, Scott, what do you think?
Nope.
yeah. There's two ways you can get upgraded on a flight nowadays. Pay for it or have such high status that you're on the upgrade list and you luck out. There is like nothing else. Planes are flying full. And
And
so
and
I think,
and even that second one is increasingly unlikely because airlines are getting so good at getting people to pay for the front of the plane that even elite status isn't getting you the complimentary upgrades that it used to 5 or 10 years ago.
yeah. I'm gonna take all your questions at the end. So I see a lot coming in, but I will just address one quick thing because it's relevant. Somebody said, you can get an e-credit on a non-refundable flight. Yeah, so just as a non-refundable flight means you just don't get cash back, right? They're not going to give you back on the card. That doesn't mean you can't cancel it and get an e-credit. It just means that you're not going to get that charge back. So I only ever buy non-refundable flights because fully refundable fares are expensive. But if you do cancel, you can get it as an e-credit.
The only thing you want to make sure of
That
though
basic
is
economy.
most won't let you do it if you book basic economy. It needs to be a main economy
Yeah,
ticket.
except basic economy.
Hmm.
Okay,
Awesome. I'm glad
thank
we
you,
cleared
Pat.
that
I
up.
just want to add that.
No, I guess along the same lines of that is, would it be beneficial, say you were thinking of upgrading yourself, or you were choosing between a regular main economy ticket or maybe splurging a bit? Or should you wait to see if you can upgrade yourself later on? Do airlines have any sort of programs that let you do so? Scott,
Mm.
I'll give it to you.
This is a good question because it's a tricky one. There's not going to be one right answer, one wrong answer here. A lot depends on how valuable would it be for you to have an upgraded seat? If this is going to be a red-eye flight and you've got a business meeting the next morning and it's really important for you to at least get a few hours of sleep, probably paying extra right at booking to make sure that you get a comfier seat, or even even if you're really lucky, a lie flat, bed essentially in the sky. But if it's one where it's just, it's a 4 hour flight, it would be more comfy to get upgraded, but it's not necessarily worth $400 or $500. The benefit of waiting is if the airline has not sold out many of these seats yet, the closer you get to travel date, the more they're willing to put up what are called offers. They'll either sometimes give you a flat price that you can upgrade at. Sometimes they'll open up an auction where they'll say, "Hey, look, how much would you bid in order to get upgraded?" And if your bid gets accepted, you get the better seat. Those are again going to be just a little bit more uncertain whether it actually happens, but if it happens, you're usually going to get it at a lower price than it would have been at booking. So I think it mostly depends on the individual and the trip. What do you think, Matt?
And I think this is also where, having frequent flyer points comes in, because oftentimes you can pay cash for main cabin and then use your points to upgrade.
Hmm.
And a lot of these are waiting list things because again, the airline's goal is to get as much money from as possible, right? And there's only X number of seats on the plane. They can't just be like, oh, well, this flight's in demand. We'll just, throw a couple more uh people in the plane or start a whole new route. It's like there's 300 something seats and that's it. And so their goal is to maximize revenue. So that's why when it comes to point redemptions, the best time to like redeem your points is like the day before booking, because that's when
Hmm.
they know, all right, no one's booking, and they release tons of upgrades, whether it's upgrades from main cabin or just straight up, you just redeem for business class.
Hmm.
So I went to Japan um, in February, and I booked my ticket 5 days before I went. Because now I guess people don't like that anxiety of it, but the truth is, like, for premium seats, the best time to redeem points is right before, because they want to sell that seat.
Yeah, it's such an interesting way that the behavior of how pricing works varies significantly whether you're paying with points or paying with cash. So with cash, we talked about your cheap flights are most likely to pop up in those Goldilocks windows, again, 1 to 3 months in advance for domestic flights, 2 to 8 months for international, a few months extra on each of those for peak season deals. But if you're paying with points, when you see award seats released in these large batches, it typically is going to be either about 10, 11 months out, or to Matt's point, a few weeks, if not a few days, but out. And so you see it right at the beginning and right at the end of the schedule when you're paying with points. And so your strategies might be quite a bit different on when to book your flight, based on how you're actually paying for that flight.
Yeah. Especially if you're trying to do premium class. Like, there's always an economy seat available for points. But if you want business or something or first, then like Scott said, it's you book the year out or you book a week out. And there's very little in between unless you just get lucky,
Mm.
um, and oftentimes there are business class available for redemption, but they're not at the saver level. So they're really trying to get, the maximum number of points. It's like 800,000, and you wait a week and it's 60,000.
Yes.
Awesome. Well, a last sort of myth bust out there. Is it ever a good idea to wait till the absolute last minute to book a flight, thinking, hoping, wishing that that flight is going to just decrease by 50%, just totally cut in half, be rock bottom cheap? Scott, what do you think?
It almost never works. And look, I think folks generally know at this point, it's generally been beaten into our brains that last minute flights are expensive these days, not cheap like it was 50 years ago when you would see a lot of standby seats getting really slashed in price. That's no longer the case. Nowadays, last minute fares tend to skyrocket rather than crash. But what's important to know is that air last minute flights aren't all equally expensive. A flight booked one day before, a ticket booked one day before it's supposed to take off is going almost certainly going to be more expensive than a flight booked 1 week before takeoff. And a flight booked 1 week ahead of time is almost certainly going to be more expensive than a flight booked a month ahead of time. So that's why even if you're in that, I would say a month is generally getting into last minute bookings. Even if you're a month out, your best bet is typically to book it if it's a flight you really need to take, rather than to hold out and to wait and hold out hope that the fare is going to go down, because it almost always goes up, especially in the final 21 days. Last thing I'll say briefly here. So there's this idea called the 21-day rule. So a lot of tickets have written in that fine print that, you click to accept the terms and conditions. In those terms and conditions, there'll be a line that says, this ticket is only available if it's purchased it has an advance purchase requirement. What it says it's only available booked at least, let's say, 21 days before travel. On day 20, that previously cheapest ticket expires. It's no longer available. And the new cheapest ticket tends to be $100 or $200 more expensive. So that's why you want to circle 21 days before your travel date is the sort of drop dead date to get it booked by. If you're hoping to travel, let's say May 23rd, you want to circle May 2nd as the final day that you need to get that flight booked by, because on May 3rd, it's almost certainly going to get pricier. Matt, what did I miss?
I mean, I think that's true. And one thing about airline pricing, and that I get this question a lot, is that one ways are often more expensive than round trips. And
Mm.
I throw away tickets all the time because airlines have this outdated mindset that leisure travelers book round trip tickets. Business travelers book one ways because oftentimes they don't know if they're when they're coming back, company's paying for it, they might have to stay an extra 3 days and they don't want to like sit on hold for an hour. So you could be like, oh, I only need a one way, New York JFK, sorry, New York Paris, and then it's like $2,000. But if you buy round trip, it's like $600. And so oftentimes I will, look at round trip prices, even if you need it one way, because sometimes you'll find it cheaper, and then just don't take the return. Or extend the return out a year in advance, and maybe, like you might fly a different airline back to Europe and be like, oh, I still have this extra way home that I didn't need at the time, but now I need.
Mm. Yeah, and that's another one of those instances where paying with points can be very different than paying with cash. Cash, you see a hugely inflated price, like Matt mentioned, about those one-way long-haul international flights. But with points, most of the time you see a one-way priced at half the price of a round trip. So if you need a one-way flight from, let's say, New York to Paris, that is a great instance of either looking to buy a round trip ticket with cash, or looking, if you've got miles, at booking a one-way ticket, because that can be where they're at some of their best value.
Yeah, that's so true. I did that last summer, also from Paris. Great. So I know we're going to wait till the end for questions, but that actually is pretty timely. Could you get banned for not taking a round trip? So say you're only using part of that trip, or are we getting into the hidden city ticketing concept? Scott, I'll let you take this one.
Yeah, so hidden city ticketing is the idea. Let's say you want to fly to Chicago. You live in Dallas, and a flight from Dallas to Chicago costs, you search it, it's nonstop for $400. But then you search for a flight from Dallas to Milwaukee that stops in Chicago, and it's only $250. Well, what you can do, of course, is book that $250 flight from Dallas to Milwaukee and just get off in Chicago, not take the onward flight to Milwaukee. That is what hidden city ticketing is. Here's the deal. It is not illegal. It is not against the law. It's not even unethical, according to the New York Times ethicist, which says that, look, if you buy an extra large pizza, you're not obligated to eat every single slice. You can do with it what you want. Once you buy that ticket from an airline, you get to do with it what you want. The airlines, though, they hate it. They don't like it at all because it undercuts their pricing strategy. And so this is why for folks, this is not a beginner tactic, hidden city ticketing, also known as skip lagging. Some folks might know it in the chat. It is not a beginner tactic. It's something that you really want to be kind of comfortable with. I would say intermediate or above, because there are a few pitfalls that you need to be aware of. If you get caught, the airline can either demand additional money, maybe at best that, at worst that at best that $150 extra for in that Chicago and Milwaukee example, potentially even more, or they say you can't get on the flight. They might confiscate your frequent flyer miles. And in some instances, if you're a repeat offender, they could ultimately ban you from the airline. You see stories in this about this in the news every once in a while. But the thing about those stories is that it is a very, very, very tiny percentage of the people who are actually doing it. The airlines will find maybe one person a year, one person every other year that they try to make an example of because they want to try to scare folks off without highlighting it too much. If they do too much, if they take them to court or really try to make a big thing of it, then all of a sudden there's a lot of news articles being written. Airline sues because passengers figure out way to get cheaper flight on their next trip. And all of a sudden everybody starts, well, what is this hidden city ticketing? How can I get cheaper flights on my next trip? So it's not for everybody, and it's not even going to work on every trip. Skiplagged.com is a great website to see if there are cheaper flights for your trip. It's something that if you do very sparingly, and again, this is not legal advice or anything, but if you do very sparingly, it's unlikely that the airline will catch you. You obviously don't want to be telling the airlines agents or anything. But if you, it's typically folks who really abuse it, are doing it 10, 15, 20 times a year and onward that are getting caught. Matt, what do you have to add there?
I mean, I'm not a huge fan of it for myself
Mhm.
because I tend to be a very big frequent flyer. I stick to a few airlines. I have status. It's not worth the risk. $100 is is not worth it if I'm going to lose 500,000 frequent flyer points. But I think for the casual traveler who is not loyal to an airline, you know, something to consider, at the very least.
Potentially on an airline that you don't fly very regularly, maybe.
Yeah, like if you're loyal to one airline, do not do it on that airline.
Mm.
Absolutely, like don't like I'm a Delta guy. I would never do it on Delta. But like I'm hardly ever on JetBlue or Frontier or something. And so if it popped up, the cost benefit to being like never allowed on Frontier or something is, whatever, who cares? Alaska, I don't fly a lot. So really think about it in a way that, I guess the question is, if you got caught and you got banned, would that be okay?
Mm.
The answer is no, then don't do it. You know,
Yeah.
Well put.
like if I got caught and banned by Alaska, how I travel, like how I fly wouldn't change. But if you're doing it on an airline, you have to fly often because maybe you live in Chicago and it's a hub, like probably not the best thing to do.
Yeah, it's definitely an ethical or an internal question, I should say, weighing the pros and cons. So I guess let's get into our sort of final topic before we take questions. How do we actually find the deals? I know some people talk about a term, reverse the search. Matt, do you want to start with that, or should I let Scott take the reins on this one?
For me, you know, you got to understand there's no one best search engine. If you're like, oh, Expedia always finds the cheapest flights. Nobody always finds the cheapest flights. So I would say, start and look at a few search engines. I like Google Flights. I like their interface a lot, but also Skyscanner and Momondo. Um, to me, those are like the three I look at to get the big airlines and the small airlines. Um, Also, when you're using these resellers like an Expedia or an Orbitz or remember that they're acting as your travel agent, and because you're not really buying direct from them, from the airline, I should say. And so they're buying the cheapest, most restrictive fares. So if you do have a problem later on, it's going to be very difficult to change your flight or get a refund. Same thing if you're using like Amex Travel or the Chase Travel portal. Like, I had a friend who booked through Amex Travel and there was an issue and she had to change her flight and they were like, yeah, you can't cancel the fare. Even though like airlines allow you to do this, because she went through this third party, their rules said you're out of luck. And so try to book direct as much as possible, but to answer the original question, try searching multiple places.
Yeah, one important thing here too is that it may sound obvious, but I think it's important to clarify. You don't have to book where you search. You can search on any of the meta sites, any of the online travel agencies, Expedia, Orbitz, Google Flights, Skyscanner, Kayak, wherever you would like. And there, I would actually encourage you to do that because that way you're not just searching on one airline. And, if Delta is not going to show you if American has a cheaper flight than them, they're not going to show you that on delta.com, but you will see it, of course, if you search on Kayak or Google Flights or wherever. But where you search for the flight doesn't have to be the same as where you book your flight. And to Matt's point, best practice is typically to book directly with the airline so you don't have a middleman if there are any changes or anything needed with your itinerary. The final thing I want to note here, this idea of reverse your search, when we talk about, look, the way to get cheap flights is not little hacks or tactics, it's to change your strategy. This is the number one tip that I can give folks when they ask, how do you find cheap flights, Scott? The number one tip I can give, if you're talking about you want to take a vacation, you want to fly somewhere, you want to just get out and unwind. This isn't a wedding. This isn't where you have to be in X destination on Y date. You've got options. The number one strategy you can do is to reverse your search. The normal way that people search for flights is a three-step process. Step one, they decide where they want to go. Step two, they decide when they want to go there. And then on step three, you look, well, what do the flights cost? And by setting price of the flights as the last priority, it's not terribly surprising that we end up with some pretty expensive flights. So if you're really hoping to get cheap flights, the trick here is to take that same three-step process and flip it on its head. Step one, where are there cheap flights available out of my home airport right now? Understanding that that changes every single day. Step two, of the places that are cheap, let's say you're in New York right now, there's a $400 round trip flight to Paris, $350 round trip to Cancun, or $200 round trip down to Miami. Say, oh, I'd love to go to Paris. Step two, pick the one that interests you the most. Paris is on there. Step three, what dates is that $400 Paris flight available that works with my schedule? And so by setting price as the top priority rather than the last priority, reversing that search, that's how you end up with cheap flights and how you're able to take 3 or 4 trips for the same price you used to pay for one. That is, if you have one takeaway from anything I've said here, it's to reverse your search for those vacations to be able to get much cheaper flights than you used to get.
Totally agree. Totally agree. No, Matt, please, please.
I do want to take time for questions, but since I've seen this pop up a lot, I want to address two things. First, Scott, one, a lot of people have been asking VPNs. Do they work? In terms of like and the second question is on cookies. And these are, again, those hacks of like trying to trick the airline into, if you search from New Zealand, are you going to get a cheaper fare than if you search from here?
Basically, no. There are for the vast majority of flights you're searching for, using a VPN, pretending like you're searching from New Zealand or somewhere else, isn't going to change the fare. There are a small subset of flights where you do see sometimes some price difference, and that tends to be domestic flights in another country. If you want to take a flight you're going to be in South Africa going on safari, and you want to fly from Johannesburg to Cape Town, you will sometimes see a cheaper flight if your search is performed in South Africa, for instance, versus in the US. Not always. This is not a guarantee. And again, it's a small subset. But the other thing that you need to be watching out for, if this is a flight that you're in the market for, is there are some number of fares, and this is much more common in South America, that are earmarked for citizens only. So there are a lot of flights, for instance, to the Galapagos Islands that fly from Guayaquil, that you get a discount if you're an Ecuadorian citizen. But if you search, you have a VPN set for Ecuador and you get that fare, but then you get to the airport and you see you've got a US passport, not an Ecuadorian one, you may end up having to pay the difference later anyway. So you want to double check if you're going to do this to see if there's any local laws about citizen only fares.
Yeah, I totally agree with this too. And those citizen-only fares are especially true like throughout South America, especially Argentina if you're ever trying to fly there. But people are trying to get this like currency arbitrage, like, and sometimes that can work. Like I have booked flights, from Australia to the US, and I like made sure that I was in Australian dollars because the US dollar was so high. It oftentimes doesn't work if based on the currency exchange rates. And the other time, it really only works if you're departing or traveling within that country of origin, as Scott said.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And the other one is the cookie myth. It's been brought up a bunch. So, Scott, why don't you just talk about how cookies
Mm.
aren't going to change your flights?
I have resolved that I'm going to become batting down this myth every week until the day I die. This is one of those that we're all very somehow invested in the idea that this has to be true, that the airlines are changing the price of the flight based on our cookies, based on our past searches. This idea that if you search for a flight New York to Paris once and you don't book it and then you search again, that they're going to raise the price on you because they see you're interested in this flight and going to try to squeeze as much money out of you. It's not true. Airfare, what's happening is that airfare is extraordinarily volatile. It's the most volatile purchase we make. And the idea that they're changing the price based on your search is akin to a modern day rain dance. The idea that, look, I did this dance and then it rained, therefore I caused that rain to come. To test this, look, we've got our flight experts at Going are searching hundreds and thousands of flights every single day. If anybody was going to see this, it would be us. But I went ahead and did a video of testing this. I searched for a flight from Denver to London, searched it once, $442 round trip, searched it twice, $442 round trip, searched it 100 times in a row. On that 100th search, just like the first one, still $442 round trip. So it's not going to impact the price. The good news, you're not going to see more expensive fares by just searching normally. But if you still don't believe me, if you say, look, I'm suspicious, it's not going to hurt your fare either to search in incognito, to clear your cookies, knock yourself out. It's just not going to make any difference.
And the one thing I would add to that is remember what I said, there's only X number of seats on a plane, right? And so, and this is going to be even, more volatile, like pricing is going to be even more volatile on, a big route like, say, New York, London, or, Chicago, Tokyo, whatever. There are 300 seats and thousands of people looking at that ticket, those seats and prices. And then you have Expedia trying to get their own tranche of tickets reserved for them. You have, uh, Orbitz and all these other third parties, travel agents. Everyone's trying to scoop up tickets, but there's still only 300 seats left on that plane. And so again, airlines are trying to change, and they use AI and dynamic pricing every second to try to like maximize value. So in the time it's taking you to open a new browser, could do the whole search all over again. Half the people on this call could have put a ticket into their checkout, which would trigger the AI to start raising prices. So, you know, causation is not correlation, or correlation is not causation. So just remember that.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just you looking for a flight at that moment in time. It's you plus 10,000 people.
Yes, very, very true. Good point, Matt. I think we'll now sort of pivot into question and answers just so we can make sure that we get all the questions that were asked earlier. I went back through the chat and I'm going to start with the question from Terrence McDonald, TJ. Will this rebooking technique for hotels, if you use a third party such as Hotwire, also work? So similar to our topic before, when you're rebooking to get that cheaper flight price, will this also work for hotels, which Matt, I know you mentioned?
Yes, if you're within that cancellate like free cancellation. So I booked through Agoda because it had the cheapest price I needed. So I made a note on the day, like up until the day I had free cancellation to check. And of course, I yesterday was the day, so I looked and I was like, oh, hey, look, it's $200 cheaper, and I made that. And so, and Keith is saying not on Hotwire. It also depends on the booking rules of the third party you're using. So, you know,
Yeah, the main thing is you just need to check if it's prepaid or if it's free to cancel.
yeah,
Most like, and you want to have a strong bias towards ones that are not prepaid, that are free to reserve, that you don't have to, that have like liberal cancellation rules, because that is, that's a real potential opportunity for you, those weeks and months between when you first book it and when you actually take your trip, to take advantage of any price drops. But if you prepaid for it, if there's no cancellations, then you're out of luck. You're not able to take advantage of those price drops. So keep that in mind when you're choosing when and where to actually book your hotel or car rental.
Awesome. Very true. Another question from Nancy along the same lines of the same topic. What about points? Are you able to cancel and rebook using points if you try to do this?
Points are actually much easier, in fact, to be able to cancel and get your full number of points back. In fact, if you've got a trip, let's say you've got some number of points, you're trying to decide whether to use points or cash. If it's a trip that's like not 100% set in stone, maybe a little bit tenuous, this can be a real advantage of booking in points, that you can cancel that reservation and get all those, the 20,000 American miles that you use, those 30,000 Delta Sky miles you use, you can cancel and get that full amount back. But again, this usually doesn't apply if it's a basic economy ticket. Usually it needs to be main economy or higher. But the main difference there between getting all your points redeposited versus paying in cash is, if you bought that ticket in cash, you paid $300 and it's main economy, you can cancel it, but you're not going to get $300 cash back. You're going to get a $300 travel credit with the airline to use for some flight over the next year. So that's certainly, that's not nothing. I'd much rather have that than the old days when you had to pay a $100 penalty, but it's not as good as being able to be exactly where you were before you booked, as it is with points, where you get all your points back.
Awesome.
and
Awesome.
you'll get the cash back too. If you cancel, if I do this all the time, because I'm always changing my travel plans, which is why I like points, because there's so much more flexibility. If I book a ticket and it's whatever points plus $200 in fees, when I cancel that ticket, I get that fees back to my credit card, and so that's another benefit to points. It's just there's a lot more flexibility.
Mm-hmm.
Very true. Awesome. We have a question from Akshat. Hi, Matt Scott. I have a Delta companion certificate for a round trip, but we're only needing to take it one way. Can we book a round trip on the companion certificate and simply not return on the flight, or is it not worth it to lose their certificate for good?
Depends
So
what the price is. Yeah, go ahead, Matt. You take this.
I
You're the Delta guy.
yeah, I just actually was trying to book a on my that companion ticket anyway. So I got the whole lowdown. Um, you can forget the other part of it too. But they won't be too happy. But you don't need to take it. You and your companion have to fly together on the same route, and you have to book a round trip. But that doesn't mean you have to return the same way.
Sage advice. This question is from Amy. What process do you recommend using when reversing your search? Is there a site you like to use to do this, or Scott, I'll
Uh,
let you.
Well, at the risk of talking my own book, this is really why we started doing going in the first place, to make sure that folks don't miss out when those cheap flights do pop up from your home airport, and why our mobile app has this real globe of cheap flights that are available from your home airport. But there's a lot of ways that you can do this, whether you're using Going or any other service. I mean, I think the biggest one is changing your mindset from thinking about it like, I have a place I want to go, and then let me just hope and pray that cheap flights pop up there, to instead saying, where are there cheap flights from my home airport? And then deciding among those. I think the mistake that we often make is setting our sights on, call it Rome, and acting as though there's nowhere else in the world we could possibly be interested in going. But if flights to Rome right now are $1,500, but flights to Amsterdam are $600, and flights to Hamburg are $300, boy howdy, I'm going to Hamburg or going to Amsterdam, not going to Rome. Or I just take advantage of that $300 flight to Hamburg and then get a budget flight, or even a train or a full service flight down to Rome once you're in Europe, that is going to be much, much cheaper. And so I think it's getting out of the mindset of thinking of just one place and then hoping for a cheap flight, and instead casting a really wide net, saying, let's see where the deals are and then see where's interested. Because I think most folks in their heart are kind of similar to how I am. There's hundreds of places around the world they'd love to go visit and see: Rome, Paris, Milan, Barcelona, Madrid, Naples, you name it. But then trying to find, letting kind of the deals decide, well, what order am I going to go in? Where should I go now? And understanding that Paris is still going to be there. Rome is still going to be there, even if it's not a cheap flight today. For the next trip, maybe I'll get more lucky and find a good deal there then.
Yeah, that's so true. Okay, we'll just take one more question because I know we are coming up to time. This is from Mark. Why do some airlines like Southwest not allow their flights to show up on search services like Google Flights? I'm guessing they want to encourage more traffic directly to their website.
Yeah, you nailed it. They get more money. They don't have to pay a commission. They don't lose. They don't have to pay a commission to online travel agencies. But what especially Southwest gets to do in this case is they get to try to sell you some of the highest profit margin products in travel, like hotels and car rentals. This is why every time you book a flight, whether it's on Southwest or any other airline, they're always going to ask you, "Hey, Katie, have you booked your hotel yet? Hey, Matt,
Mhm.
do you need a car rental on that trip?" Because they get, really high commissions for those things. And they know you're going to be in this destination on these dates. They're much more likely to do that. But if Southwest allowed their tickets to be sold on Expedia or Orbitz, then it's Expedia or Orbitz that gets to ask about the hotels and car rentals, not Southwest. So look, uh, uh, it's a bold strategy. You're going to miss out on a lot of people who are searching on Google Flights, Expedia, Orbitz. You're going to miss out on a lot of folks who might otherwise not be aware that there was a cheap Southwest flight on that route. But they're doing something right, because they are the largest domestic airline in the U.S. I think they've been profitable every single quarter in their existence, something like that. 40, 50 years. I'm loath to question the strategy, even if I would, as a traveler, prefer to not have to always remember, oh, go to southwest.com separately if I'm traveling domestically, because their tickets don't show up on flight search engines.
Thank you, Scott. We are at the time. So I guess that's it for today. Thank you, Scott, for coming and sharing your wisdom. Thank you, Katie, for moderating and helping us. This is being recorded, and tomorrow will be uploaded, and you'll get an email with a link to Going, travel resources, Scott's book, and a replay of this video so that you can watch it again. And, in case you missed something the first time. So with that, have a great rest of the day. Enjoy the week. And we'll see you on the next webinar we do later this month, which will be on travel insurance. So
Thank you
bye,
so much,
everybody.
everybody.
Thanks, everyone.